Nice to see everybody. So the plan for today is to talk about a particular astronomical tradition. And I'm hoping it will be useful for those of you who are doing cultural astronomy projects of various sorts, as well as those of you doing historical astronomy of the ancient Mediterranean region. Uh, I'll just start by putting us sort of in context where we are and when we are. Okay, so here we are.
Sorry, has
This is
anyone in the
a
room got their mic on still? Because we're getting like double up.
so if you're on the Zoom call,
It's me. It's fine. Go, go.
all right. Here we are. This is the Mediterranean. Um, Up above is Europe. Africa is down below. The Atlantic is on the sort of left-hand side of this. And on the right-hand side, we have the western part of Asia. And that's where we're going to be spending most of today, in this region here. So this is Mesopotamia, which is the ancient Greek name for the territory now known as Syria and Iraq. And it literally means the land between rivers. So the two rivers are the Euphrates and the Tigris. Both of them flow from the mountain ranges of eastern Anatolia out into the Persian Gulf. And this fertile land between is bordered by the foothills of the Zagros Mountains along the eastern bank of the Tigris and by the Arabian Desert to the west of the Euphrates. So it's naturally divided into a northern and a southern region. Because in the northerly parts, you've got kind of limited annual rainfall, and you can't do the irrigation agriculture that you can do in the south as easily. But there's very good pasture for sheep and later for horses once they're introduced from the Eurasian steppe. So the economy up there is much more pastoral, much more based on pasturage and cattle. And in the south, it's a very marshy, fertile region because the Persian Gulf, which is that body of water you see down on the right-hand bottom corner, that used to come up a lot farther into this area of land than it does. As it receded, it left very, very fertile soil, which is swampy, high in food sources, very easy to defend against invasion. And this was where the first complex states in human history emerged. They expanded first from that agricultural south into the pastoralist north. This all happened around the beginning of the fourth millennium BCE. Hello. So Mesopotamia has a very deep, long history. We are going to spend most of our time in the very latest phase of it. But I wanted to give you some chronological anchors that may or may not be familiar to you, just so you can get a sense of the stuff that's already happened and where we are going to be, so you can get your bearings. What we're going to talk about today, which is the development of a predictive astronomical science, belongs to the very latter end of that history. Nearly everything we're going to cover happened in the first millennium BCE. All the primary source evidence, most of the primary source evidence, I should say, that I'll show you today comes from a period of a little under 400 years between 911 and 539 BCE. And in this period, Mesopotamian thinkers developed a really accurate, powerful, predictive method for determining when celestial phenomena were going to occur. And it was based on extensive record keeping and observation of patterned repetitions in the behavior of the sun, the moon, and the planets. It was purely arithmetical. And what I mean by that is we have no texts from these communities which made any attempts to graphically describe what the sky looked like, or even sort of work out in detail like how the movements of these heavenly bodies were going, or what they were made of, or what caused them to move, or any of this. It was just a purely arithmetical means of saying, this is the amount of time that spans the interval between this thing and its repetition. For instance, an eclipse and its repetition. The evidence we'll look at comes mainly from just four cities, these four cities. We start off in the first half of this period we're looking at. This whole region and a lot of the Levant, that coast down on the sort of middle leftish part, this is ruled by a northern empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, whose capital is Assur and then later moves to Nineveh. And the southern heartland of Babylonian culture is at this point a kind of rebellious province, first in sort of de facto, but not de jure, and then later de jure, a province of this empire. In the second half of the period, though, the Assyrian Empire collapses and a dynasty from Babylon arises. And this is our Neo-Babylonian Empire, which lasts nearly a century before it is toppled by the Persians coming in from Iran, the Achaemenid Empire. Almost all the astronomical research by cuneiform scholars that we're looking at today comes from this period. It continued after the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And in fact, its most impressive mathematical achievements date from after that fall. They are really achievements of the last 3 centuries BCE. By that period, Babylonian diviners were able to predict the length of a whole series of time intervals between the risings or settings of the sun and moon in a given month. They were able to predict the zodiacal longitude and the length of an eclipse, the heliacal and acronychal risings, disappearances, and stations of planets. Stations being when they're about to begin their retrograde motion and they kind of stop for a minute. So this is stuff that's quite difficult to predict. I mean, these are really quite impressive achievements for the ancient world, and they were the basis of the entire mathematical astronomical tradition of later Western Islamicate Indian astronomical theory. So the foundations of those achievements were laid in the first half of the first millennium BCE. That's a very quick historical overview of what we're doing. I guess I also wanted to ask why you might be interested in this material if you're not someone who works on the ancient world and you don't care about the Neo-Babylonian Empire or Persians. How could this be useful to members of a research group like this? First, I think it makes for an interesting contrast case with many of the things that people in this room work on, because it's a dead, complete tradition, and it exists purely as a historical artifact. Lots of you guys are engaged in your research with traditions that have living practitioners and which are often the sort of cultural treasures of groups that have been subject to imperial or colonial violence. One thing we've talked about extensively is the position of the researcher vis-a-vis traditions like that. How do you responsibly engage with these traditions? How do you find interlocutors who can welcome you into them? The importance of collaboration, also the difficulties of collaboration. So I thought one reason that this is interesting is that that situation just does not exist with this material. There are no living representatives of the tradition. There aren't even inheritors of the tradition. The language that this stuff is recorded in was forgotten for about 1800 years. Nobody could read or write it. It had to be deciphered in the 19th century. There is no living descendant of the language. Obviously, this doesn't mean that the position of the researcher ceases to matter. The study of Middle Eastern cultural history is not an apolitical field, but the position that you're in differs from the position that many other cultural astronomers are in that there is no position you can be in that brings you closer to the material. Everybody starts out as an outsider and has to make their way in through study of the primary sources. So I'm hoping it will be interesting just as, a contrast case for what it looks like to study an astronomical tradition that's done, that's not going to develop any further in the future, and which doesn't bear on the interests of any existing person. Second, despite this great distance that we have separating us from the objects of our investigation, we also have information that's not really available in many other contexts that we study astronomical traditions. So our records are really, really good. Our documents, stuff I'll show you today, or at least one, these aren't documents that are transmitted through like a history of people copying and recopying manuscripts. We have the actual autograph copies of the scholars and thinkers that we are talking about from 3,500 years ago, or from 2,500 years ago, whenever you, the ones that they themselves made, the tablets that they pressed. And often we know their names, their biographies, their career paths. We know where they lived. We know the rooms in which they worked. We can reconstruct huge, huge amounts of information about their family connections, what they were paid, what their professional day-to-day looked like. We have letters from them. We have archival accounts from their households that tell us how many, pounds of silver they were collecting in rents in a given year. It's really more information than you know what to do with. So again, I'm thinking here this is an interesting contrast, not necessarily with people who work on living traditions of cultural astronomy, but with another kind of cultural astronomy. I'm thinking here, and speaking mainly from ignorance, but of that focuses on the records, the non-textual records of ancient or pre-modern peoples, and looks for things like alignments with astronomical phenomena in architecture or in settlement planning or in art, that kind of thing. The reason I think it's useful is that my impression, and again, this is untutored, but this work sometimes sort of presumes that astronomical information is going to be interesting to a culture, that there's no question about when you observe that the sun moves back and forth on the horizon from solstice to solstice, that is naturally a phenomenon that you'll want to integrate into your calendar or your ritual, or it will stick out as important to you in a way that doesn't need to be further explained. Because knowledge of the workings of the cosmos is just obviously valuable. And I think that's a very hasty assumption, which I'm going to sort of try to convince you today why that's the case. Because we know so much about the people who did Mesopotamian astronomy, we can conclusively say they were not interested in this stuff for scientific reasons. They were not, at least initially, working because of an interest in the stars or in the cosmos. Instead, they were working to pursue their own personal interests within hierarchical professions where they were trying to improve their position in an employment situation more than anything else. I think looking at those dynamics is really useful for challenging some of our assumptions about why people do astronomy in the ancient or the pre-modern worlds. Right, now this did lead them into very accurate quantitative methods for predicting astronomical phenomena. But they didn't develop those methods because they valued things like precision or quantifiability or empirical observation or accuracy as such. And these developments were also only possible because there was a massive state investment in training and paying hundreds of these people to be able to do and share observation of the stars in a way that allowed them to build up a record of astronomical data. And I think that is a helpful control on speculation about what astronomical information or knowledge we should attribute to cultures where we don't have a textual record. We can see what did it take to actually figure this out in the Mesopotamian case, and is it plausible that this could be figured out in a situation where the same state structure is not in place or the same institutional structure is not in place. So again, just like because of the density of the information, a good thing to look at as we try to assess traditions about which we know far less. Okay, third, and relatedly, I think that the study of the historiography of this tradition makes for very interesting reading for people who work on traditions which are often negatively assessed by people skeptical of cultural astronomy work as primitive or unscientific or mythological or something like this, because all of these are charges that have been brought against Babylonian astronomy or defended by people who work on Babylonian astronomy. You saw in the reading for this afternoon, scholars of the ancient world in the 20th century were very concerned to attack or defend Mesopotamian science, as quantifiable, predictive, accurate, precise, that kind of thing. That's a picture of science that's very informed by the model of the physical and the exact sciences as they stood in the 20th century. And it's very informed also by debates in philosophy over the demarcation of science from pseudoscience. And the result of this framing of how we assess this tradition was that it radically distorted our understanding of what was going on and why these people were working on astronomy in the first place. So again, I think that's helpful, since it's extremely tempting for researchers on any astronomical tradition to try to assert its value by pointing out those aspects of it which seem to align with the sciences of the present day, that bring it into line with what science or forms of knowledge production that are prestigious today look like. And that can often be a mistake. Looks like we'll be able to put stuff up on this in a second.
I just work on it. It might be that the acoustics suddenly get a bit skewed, but we'll see.
Thank you. Okay, so that's me talking a lot. and I'm going to continue to talk a lot, but I've only got about, I don't know, 60, 80 minutes for this 2 hour seminar. So what I want is for people to jump in when they have thoughts. There's a lot of information to present, but oh, excellent. All right. Is that working for everybody? Okay. Let me start by just showing you what our data for this stuff looks like. This is a cuneiform tablet. Anyway, let me mute myself. This is a cuneiform tablet. Now, can people online still hear me? All right, fantastic. As you can see, it's somewhat difficult to read. I want to focus on just part of it. We have actually several students of Akkadian in the room with us, so I'll make them see what they can make of it.
Tom, sorry to interrupt. I think if you mute yours, my recording is going to be blank
Oh,
for sound.
right. Okay.
What
So
if we mute the room and then unmute?
Okay, I can mute the room. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
It's muted.
this still works.
Good.
We'll take a break shortly, and we can just switch over to this thing if that's easier. So focus on just these 2 columns, one of which is quite severely damaged, and the other of which is fairly full. The signs that you're seeing pressed into the clay there are going to show up in a second. Oh no, here we go. Yeah, let's zoom in on them. All right. The signs here are these. It's quite difficult to make them out. This took me about 20 minutes of trying to figure out what was going on, but this is what they are. Obviously, most of us can't make any sense of this, but there is a pattern here that I think we can maybe identify. Look at the left-hand column. It's just got 4 signs, not the many signs that run continuously down the right-hand column. Any guesses as to what those signs represent?
Yes.
Yes. How'd you know that?
Well,
Damn.
I have done data columns myself.
Okay, fantastic. So these are years. In fact, they're the numbers of regnal years. The triangular kind of wedge shapes. Look at the top one there. You got a triangular wedge, sort of an arrow-shaped wedge, and then you've got 4 short ones stacked on top of, well, 4 with 3 stacked on top of 1. That's the number 14. And then next down, you've got 3 of the things. That's 15, 16. Then we've got a couple missing, and then the one down there is 19. These are indeed year numbers, and then the names of months. And you can see that for each year, we have 2 month names. In the case of year 15, we have 3 month names because there's an intercalary month, dear, appended. 16, we're missing the 17 and the 18, but there would be 2 months identified in these columns as well. And they translate to the 14th year, first month, then the 7th month, in the 15th year, the first month and the 7th month, and an intercalary month. In the 16th, the 6th, and the 9th, and the 17th, the 5th, blah, blah, blah. What you're seeing here is a regnal year and a month. And the tablet records months of the reigns of Achaemenid Persian kings in which a lunar eclipse is possible.
Sorry, can I just jump in with a question?
Of course.
What do you mean by regnal?
So the years of the rule. So it starts with when you,
Yes.
exactly. So year 31 of Darius I is the 31st year in which Darius was in power. So this tablet records stuff from 490 to 374. Obviously, this is not a predictive tablet, because while you can predict eclipses or eclipse possibilities, you cannot predict how long the reign of a particular Persian king is going to last. So this is a tablet that it's the reason it looks so difficult. There are erasures, the signs aren't nice. This is like a practice tablet. It hasn't been made into a fair copy. And what this scribe has been doing is using a method to figure out past dates on which eclipses were possible for kings that ruled before him. So this comes from the end of the period that the tablet recorded. Why would it only be necessary to record the month in which it's possible? Archaeo astronomers.
Come on, class. If it's gonna be a lunar eclipse, there's only one day in that month that could possibly occur, which is the full moon.
Bingo. Yes. And if it's a solar eclipse, this tablet doesn't record solar eclipses, but it will be the new moon.
I get a cookie going?
Excellent. So if you've got the month, then you know the day on which an eclipse is going to occur? No. On which an eclipse might occur, or at least might be visible for you. The method that this student or scholar is working with is a cycle of eclipses that we can sort of figure out from this very simplified version of some Babylonian data. This is a record of solar eclipses visible from Babylon from the 8th to the 2nd century BCE. What is the rule here? How can we predict an eclipse based on recurrent patterns in this data? The date, that minus sign means BCE. So minus 746 is 746 BCE.
That's simple. It's because it's 1 year.
Yes, sorry, yes.
So we're looking at 6 different zero cycles here, right?
Yes, yeah. But in terms that don't need you to know what a Saros cycle is, what's a Saros cycle?
About an 18.6 year cycle, which the eclipse will occur at the same time in the same orientation.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. Every 6,585 point something days, the moon and the sun return to the same relative position. If you draw like a line from the Earth to the sun, the moon will be in the same position along that line every roughly 18 years and 11 days. As a result, if an eclipse occurs, you can be sure that after those 6,585 days, an identical or nearly identical eclipse will also occur. So you can use this cycle to predict eclipses. The problem is that the eclipse, although it will occur, may not occur over the same part of the Earth's surface. And as a result, if you are a Babylonian astronomer who does not know that the Earth is round and does not know how big the Earth is, you've got an issue where you can predict that an eclipse might be possible, but sometimes it doesn't happen, and you don't really have an explanation for why. You can determine without geometrical modeling why once you have enough data, but sometimes you're just going to be like, there can be an eclipse, and then it happens on the other side of the world, so you don't know that it in fact happened. So this is a cycle that allows you to predict that you might see an eclipse. But that's useful because it can guarantee that you will not see an eclipse on other days, that there won't be an eclipse on a particular day. This was a very, very difficult thing for ancient peoples to work out. I said before, this data was like simplified. Here is a sort of less simplified version, because there's not just one Saros cycle. There's not just one 18-year cycle with an eclipse at the end of it. There are multiple cycles of these eclipses, identical eclipses separated by 18 years, and they kind of intersperse with one another, with the result that if you are looking at the record of eclipses, it's going to take a long, long time and a lot of data collection before you can figure out that it's this 18-year pattern, because individual eclipses are not going to be separated by obviously predictable lengths of time from one another. You have to get something like this and then start analyzing the data. And that's really tough because you have to have immaculate record keeping and observation for multiple decades. In fact, for multiple centuries. This is going to be a project that outspans the lifetime of any one scholar, and also cannot depend on a single person or even like a single team of people. You need people all over the region and preferably all over the world. They didn't have that, but they did have lots of different sites where they were collecting this data. Because if it's cloudy, you miss the lunar eclipse and you don't get the record. So this is the knowledge that enables you to predict eclipses, but it can only be obtained in a kind of institutional structure that is very complex, that involves a lot of people over a very long period of time. So the basic question I want to ask today and sort of talk through with you is, who figured this out and why did they bother figuring it out? That's where the real interest of Mesopotamian astronomy for us, I think, comes into the picture. And the best way to start is with this guy, Ashurbanipal, who is the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who reigned from 669 to 631. That is him depicted fighting a lion, which he did do, but not like that. He stood in a very well-protected chariot and shot them with arrows.
Pretty.
So he's who is this guy? Well, he was never expected to rule. I think he was like the second or third son of someone. He was actually trained as a priest. So he was trained in scribal knowledge. He was trained to read and write, and he was trained to interpret omens. And he had no military training as part of his education before he came into the kingship. So what he did, like an Assyrian king is supposed to go out on campaign every year and personally participate in territorial conquest. He instead sat at home at Nineveh and read omens and communed with the goddess Ishtar, and that was his contribution to the war effort. So he is really a diviner. All right. And he was also very interested in the collection of scholarship in the cuneiform languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, from all over the empire. And he had people send out 4 tablets, which he'd bring back to Nineveh, copy, and he had most of our tablets in the early period of Assyriology were from his archive after the palace collapsed on it and kind of preserved it all. All right. So the reason I want to get to him is because he was a king who needed to make his reputation on his knowledge of the professions of the ancient Mesopotamian world. And in his autobiographical descriptions, he presents himself as a scholar above all. Okay, I'll read this out. This is from an autobiographical inscription. Marduk, the sage of the gods, gave me wide understanding and broad perceptions as a gift. Nabu, scribe of the universe, bestowed on me the acquisition of all his learning as a present. Ninurta and Nergal, these are all gods, gave me physical fitness, manhood, and unparalleled strength. I learned the lore of the wise sage Adapa, the hidden secret, the whole of the scribal art. I can discern celestial and terrestrial portents and deliberate in the assembly of scholars. I'm able to discuss the series if the liver is a mirror image of the sky with learned experts. All of these things we're going to come back to and sort of look at in deeper detail. I can solve convoluted reciprocals and calculations that do not come out evenly. What he means there is that he can do fractions, which is an impressive skill in the ancient world.
Put that on the episode.
Today as well, I hope.
I have read cunningly written text in Sumerian, dark Akkadian, the interpretation of which is difficult. I have examined stone inscriptions from before the flood. This is the primeval flood that separates the age of myth from the age of that we share as mortals, which are sealed, stocked up, mixed up. Okay. What do we learn from this? We've got 2 things that he wants to boast about. On the one hand, he's got all of these sort of natural characteristics or divinely gifted characteristics like bodily strength and understanding and awareness. But there's also this distinct thing, Ixum, learning, which he has to learn and which is connected particularly to writing. Nabu, the scribe of the universe, bestowed on me the acquisition of all his learnings at present. Learning is the gift of Nabu, god of literacy. It's attained through mastery of the scribal craft. Tuksharutum is how that's called, tablet learning or tabletiness. Scribal education is restricted. It's a hidden secret, and it's very ancient. It's connected with the wise man, the legendary sage Adapa. So writing has been invented about 4 or 5 times in the history of our species. But in this region of the world, it was invented in Mesopotamia. You saw before a tablet. This is how they're made. You take a reed stylus, you press it into soft clay. Pass this around. This is one I made for Open Day. And you just impress into the clay these signs with the edge of a stylus, as follows. Initially, the script was, it kind of it became a script in the process of recording the Sumerian language, but it was soon adapted to the Akkadian language, which is the language of all the texts we're looking at today. And it was both phonographic and logographic. So some signs are just read as sounds. Other signs are read as ideograms. They mean a word or something. So it works like Japanese or many languages have similar-ish things. Because it was used for such a long time and for several different languages, its means of encoding information became incredibly complex. I'm going to give you some examples. Here is one sign. This is the sign for king. And initially it's used as an ideogram for Sumerian lugal, literally big man, king. But in Akkadian, it's used with the same meaning, but the Akkadian word is different. It's sharam. So this is how you write in Akkadian, sharam, king. And because sometimes you use this in a sort of rebus way, you can also use this sign to write just the sound shar, the first part of the word for king.
Quick,
Yeah.
some of the way it was showing like you like press it and then like with the stylus, because you're holding it in your right hand towards the right side. Was this a purely like right hand done like language or like
Yes.
yeah, okay.
You cannot do it with your... So I'm left-handed, and it's a real pain for me.
No, so that's why I was curious.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But that's the way it's got to do. All right, so that's actually a comparative simple sign. I'm going to give you an example of how messed up this becomes with this. This looks simple, but as you guys know, it's not. This is a sign that was used to write the Sumerian word ud, which means sun or day. But in Akkadian, the word for sun and day, those are different words. So in Akkadian, you can use this sign to write shamshum, sun, or you can write umum, day. Can mean either of those two things. Because the sun is a god, it can also be used to write Utu, the sun god, in Sumerian, who is Shamash in Akkadian. And it was also used to write the related semantic concept of bright in Sumerian. But the Sumerians, their word for bright was babar. So the way you say silver in Sumerian is kug babar, bright metal. And as a result, you see this sign also used in Akkadian for their word for silver, which is kaspum. So already we've got about 6 different meanings. It was also used for the verb go out, which was an abbreviation of a longer way of writing that in Sumerian. So it can also be just the ideogram for the verb to go out. And in addition to all of these ideographic meanings, it has multiple phonetic meanings. The primary phonetic meaning is ud or ut or ut, which is just how it's said in Sumerian. But it could also represent the sounds par and pir, and tam, and hish, and lich. Those dozen meanings are its most frequent. It has many, many more less frequent meanings. So this was a script that was extremely complex and required about 6 years of training for a Mesopotamian apprentice. For us, it takes 2 semesters.
I don't want to open a full can of worms, but given that we have the plate tablets, where do the words come from? Where does the knowledge of the words come from?
Yeah, you're right. So we have this script. So where does the knowledge of that?
Yeah, okay, obviously, okay, here's the sign, but where do we know that the Akkadian word for silver is actually Casper?
Okay. Because as you can imagine, a young scribe who was learning this system had to press millions of tablets where they spell out cuspum phonetically and then say, this is how you write cuspum.
So basically, we have dictionaries.
We have dictionaries. Yeah, we've got glosses. This took a long, long time to figure out. Okay, that's just to give you a picture of how this worked. And this brings us back to Ashurbanipal's claim that he's read cunningly written text in Sumerian and obscure Akkadian, dark Akkadian, Sululu Akkadu. So you can see now what that would mean. The versions of those signs that I showed you were as they were written in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, but it's a handwritten script. They don't have typewriters, they don't have computers, so they change over the centuries. So he's also thinking like he's probably read tablets that have been collected from the time of Hammurabi, and he can read the version of the script that was active at that period. So it is a real impressive attainment. But he also, makes these fake claims about examining inscriptions from before the flood. And here we see that this antediluvian knowledge, this mystical deep origin of the knowledge is really important to the prestige of writing as well. What I want to focus on is the present day basis of that prestige. Ashurbanipal says he can discern celestial and terrestrial portents, and he can deliberate in the assembly of scholars. That's quite an unusual claim for a king to make as a way of presenting himself as this like superhuman thing, right? I can go to the seminar and have a debate with the experts in this thing. Like that's not how kings tend to represent themselves, as being competent to discuss with experts in a particular field their own expertise. But that is how he does it, because his studies fall under the jurisdiction of existing professions in ancient Mesopotamia. When he says he knows terrestrial and celestial portents, he's saying, I have mastered two different professional arts. I have mastered the art of the Baru. That's the person who does provoked omens. So the person who cuts open an animal and looks at its entrails and says, I provoked the omen and now I can interpret it for you. Terrestrial portents is how this is translated. But also the unprovoked omens. You can't cut open the sky. You just have to wait for stuff to happen in it. So he can also look at things like the sky or weather events or monstrous births, that kind of thing. And he can interpret what those omens presage about the future. So knowledge, even a king's knowledge, has to be legitimated by these professionals. The real proof of his competence is that he can go and talk to people who know how to do this and be recognized as an expert. And he employed a large number of different professionals in his court. I won't go through a full list, but we can say there were probably about 50 people at Nineveh who were just there employed in their profession as readers of tablets, interpreters of omens, and performers of certain rituals. So here we're coming back to what I said about the institutional basis of astronomical knowledge. The people that were doing the prediction were not full-time celestial predictors. They were part of a system of professionals, and often they were competent in multiple professions. Here are the sort of 5 that you should think of these as like the equivalent of going to graduate school. You could become a Baru, someone who cuts open animals. You could become an Ashipu. You are performing magical rituals to drive away disease-causing demons, and you're also diagnosing and prognosing disease. You're saying what's causing this and how is it going to develop? Or you could be an Asu, where you are basically a physician and a surgeon and someone who treats actual medical ailments. Or you could be a lamenter, a Kalu, who performs rituals often by singing at the temple. All of these people were Tupsharu scribes, people who could read and write, but Tupsharu gets kind of specialized in meaning to people who can read and write and who know particular omen series having to do with these stars in the sky. These people were all employed by the state mostly at temple complexes. When Sargon II endowed, well, when he built his new capital, he endowed a temple at Nabu and he set up daily offerings to sustain an ashipu at that temple. So this was a person who had like a guaranteed income to perform their prognostications. Okay. The people we're interested in are the experts in unprovoked omens. And usually they were actually, this was their secondary expertise. They did one of these other things, most often Baru or Ashipu. And then on the side, they were looking at the celestial omens. Most people who could read and write learned to do some celestial omen prediction. And they learned from a particular text called the Enuma Anu Enlil, which is a 70-tablet text that just records, if this happens, then this other thing is going to happen. Mostly astronomical and meteorological phenomena. Who were these people? They were attested in colleges at lots of different major cities in Mesopotamia. Probably about 10 people worked in a team. They were led by a chief scribe. Everyone on the team is looking for omens, both in the sky, but also in the rising of the rivers and the weather and price fluctuations in the market, this sort of thing. And then the chief scribe writes a report to the king regularly and says, here's what we've observed in our corner of the empire. Here's what it means for you, according to my expertise. Here's what we've done to ensure that the bad consequences of this omen are stopped. We've performed a ritual that saves you from the bad thing that was going to happen. That's how it goes. These people were compensated with a house, with a field, slaves who would work the field, and they also got a healthcare plan. They were entitled to the services of an ashu who would come and treat their diseases when they needed it. So they also negotiated bonuses in livestock and property occasionally. They complain frequently that they don't get enough money.
These scribes,
Yeah.
what kind of social backgrounds were they coming from? Do we know?
Yes, we do. We know very, very well. We know who they married. We know who their parents were, their grandparents, their great-great-grandparents. They come from a set of families who own prebends in the temples. What that means is they are entitled to perform a particular fraction of a particular job at a particular temple and receive money in exchange for it. In order to do this, you have to be born of an ordained priest. You have to go through severe purificatory rituals. One thing we know about them, they were all shaved completely bald from head to toe because that's what you had to be in order to enter into the parts of the temple that they worked in. So they were raised in these hereditary situations where they had basically a sinecure if they did a particular job in the temple for their lives. Yeah. And they were almost exclusively kind of intermarrying with other people of that social class.
So it was a higher social class, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. They are living much, much better than the huge majority of people in Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
But was it the kind of highest class, or was it like basically academics in a middle class, comfortable life, but the richest or most powerful of all people?
Once the economy becomes monetized significantly, merchants are much, much better off than these people. And they start doing these kind of extractive rents on them that drive them into severe debt. And it's bad. It's not as good a position as it once was. But initially, these are the sort of administrative staff of the state and of the temple. Temple in Mesopotamia is not merely a religious institution, but also an economic institution. It's where people deliver their taxes and what redistributes the taxes to the surrounding community. So basically, these are government bureaucrats. But a lot of what they're doing is reading these incredibly complex and useless tablets about what's going to happen if you see, Mars twinkling on a particular night or something. I'll introduce you to some of them shortly. But here's a good example. Here's one guy we know. Ishar Shumu Eresh was the chief scribe under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. And he succeeded his father in this post of chief scribe at the palace at Nineveh. What he did day to day was basically scheduling rituals and festivals. He would inspect building works. He would advise the royal family. He would handle payments, and he would do this all on the basis of his alleged expertise in omens. So this was his expertise that was qualifying for him to become chief scribe. His career wasn't typical. He was very successful, but it would be the kind of thing that a junior scribe would aspire to become. So we'll look at how he talks to Ashurbanipal in a second. Okay. So what are these guys doing? How do they actually divine? Here's a text that tells us, gives us instructions. It was like a handbook or a manual used by these people in their predictions. And this is how it describes what they're supposed to do. You tell the future from observations in the present. You memorize omen series so that when you see an ominous thing, you see something of ominous significance, you can remember what's supposed to happen as a result of it, and you can also remember what you're supposed to do to avert that result. So basically, the tablets that you memorize supply you with this enormous list of conditional statements, which all take the form of if this, then that, if P, then Q. If there is a city on a hill, then the western part of the region will be in turmoil, that kind of thing. If a woman gives birth to a dog, then the head of a household will die. That's a real one. So, and that's important, right? That these are not merely astronomical things. These are not, if there is an eclipse on this day, then 18 years and however many days later there will be another eclipse. It's also, if a woman gives birth to a dog, then the head of the household will be in trouble. So it goes, yeah, when you look up a sign in these omen collections, be it one in the sky or one on earth, and if that sign's evil portent is confirmed, we can take that as a sort of if P, then it has indeed occurred with regard to you in reference to an enemy or to a disease or to a famine. That's our consequent of our antecedent. If P, then Q. All right, you don't want something to happen to you in reference to an enemy or a disease or a famine. So what do? Check the date of that sign, and should no sign have occurred to counteract it, should not annulment have taken place. So here you're looking up in your encyclopedia of omens. This happens. Did this later thing happen which counteract it? No. If so, I need to make something happen that will counteract it. So I'm going to do a ritual. So if P, then Q, unless either something has occurred to counteract it or you've already performed the annulment ritual, then the thing will definitely happen. This is the form of the claim. And it's actually like it's a procedure of reasoning that you can just represent like this as a valid modus ponens argument. It's just like an algorithm that you plug different things into to generate conclusions from this form of argument.
It will definitely happen unless you purchase this product with
yeah, unless you purchase from me my ritual, which shows you. So,
do we know whether there is an idea about how the annulment is functioning? I'm asking because of the kind of astrological premises. Is it that we can actually engage with the heavens like the kind of Chinese model of astrology would be, or is it more like we can stop the gods from getting the wrath down on us?
There is absolutely no discussion of the causal mechanism behind any of this. So there's just the claim, if this happens, then this happens, and you can prevent it by doing this thing, but there is no theory of why any of this works at all. You simply learn the rules. And this is the sort of disadvantage of this system, right? That it's an algorithm that generates valid arguments, but because the premises that you're told to plug into those arguments are often false, mostly the result is valid but unsound arguments which have the right structure, but which are in fact not true.
Kind of argument that can be played by a 3-year-old going, that's why.
Now we're coming back to the point of all this. Why did this allow them to predict celestial phenomena? Solar and lunar eclipses were conceived to be very dangerous for people on the throne. So if you get an eclipse, something bad is going to happen to the ruler of the country. But you can avoid this either by performing a ritual after the eclipse, but that's not so good. The eclipse is a really bad thing. You don't want that happening. The rituals aren't so powerful. But you can avoid the eclipse if you know it's going to happen in advance by a ritual that was frequently performed in these centuries, where you take a subject of the king, and in the month where an eclipse is going to occur, or in the period where the eclipse is going to occur, you ritually invest that subject with the kingship itself. You place that person on the throne. The existing king takes a fake name, moves to a little hovel somewhere in the peasant community. Then, once the eclipse goes over, you execute the person that you put on the throne. Then you go back. So
Seems quite cool.
It certainly did come through. It came on for an eclipse. Had something very terrible happened to him.
exactly. So that's the other way that you can work out the bad juju. You can just make the death happen yourself to this other person. Now, as a result, diviners have this very strong professional incentive, not just to say, oh, an eclipse happened, but to tell the king, hey, an eclipse is going to happen. Get off the throne, find your substitute king, make yourself safe. And as a result, this is why they, in this system, which was supposed to find eclipses happening, which was supposed to be like a foolproof method of we're going to notice every eclipse in the country, even if it's a cloudy night in this part, because we've got 10 teams all over the place looking every night. We've got people on duty. They suddenly discover that there are these patterns that allow you to predict the eclipses in advance. And then they can say to the king, hey, an eclipse is coming. Imagine that you are a king and your diviner comes and tells you that an eclipse is coming, and then it happens. It really does occur. I mean, it's an astonishing feat of, on the one hand, predictive astronomy, but also like it's a very impressive thing to do. So it was one of the main sort of proofs that raised the status of these diviners in this period, that they could really predict this astonishing event in advance, except of course when it didn't happen, because it happened on the other side of the world.
On a note, so in arctic astronomy, I don't know if you can bring there, what did I say this week about your motivation for predicting eclipses for astronomers?
What will do?
What did I say to those of you in the class? It was this week. 2 days ago.
2 days ago.
And I said the primary motivation for being able to predict an eclipse wasn't the interest in the science, but it was, yes, in the way of keeping your head attached to your body was a pretty good motivator for a lot of that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm glad to know that my lecture worked.
Yeah.
I think we did have a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Laura.
It's like, are these like room at if you look up and there's when you're blind? Do they have a way to rationalize that?
They must have figured it out. For some people, I suppose. I don't know of any texts that tell us they had the devices for safely looking at it. But presumably, the eclipse is an ominous phenomenon.
You can look at the sun and not go blind, just don't stare at it for
Yeah.
And also the problem with the looking at the eclipse is rather than when the sun comes back. And if you're just interested whether an eclipse happens, yeah. Okay, there is a bit of shadow there.
keeping in mind two important things, trees and things around you are like just pinholes. So the light of that eclipse will come down and you'll see cast on the ground shadows of little like crescents all over the ground because it leaves out as pinholes. But also in cultures, it's not uncommon to use some kind of a device. So I talked to a Thai elder and a Atlanta elder, and they just said they hold up a piece of wood when they want to look at eclipses. They put dry coconut grass, they light it on fire, and it creates a really dark smoke, and they just hold it up and look at the sun and smoke. So there's lots of innovative ways of doing this. You can stare at the sun. You can look at the sun for a few seconds and not go blind.
When we talk about eclipses, we are in this point exclusively talking about total solar and lunar eclipses, correct?
No, partial as well.
Oh.
Yeah. So they're observing every partial eclipse that they can. And I mean, one of the results of this is that this systematic data collection within 100 years yielded this first amazing result, the Saros cycle that allowed you to predict eclipses in advance. From that period, no eclipse occurred which had not been predicted in advance in Mesopotamian history. Some were predicted and did not appear to occur, but no eclipse was not, forewarned by these diviners.
Strategy of kind of putting a substitute king on the throne. Where is it recorded? Is it in these kind of same dividing texts or?
Yeah, there's ritual texts which tell you what to do, but there are also chronicles, annals of the kings themselves that say that they've done this. So we know it was, I think Ashurbanipal did it. Esarhaddon did it like 7 times or something.
If an eclipse was predicted and they put a false king on the throne and then it didn't occur, did they still execute them?
That I don't know. That's an interesting question.
And the other question I had, whether the first time the diviner came in, there was an eclipse going to happen, the king didn't believe him and then was executed. And that all future kings, all that realized the story. They don't listen to those guys.
So what did this allow them to do? We can tell that they were like astonished by this because over this period, the actual methods of observation start to become much, much more precise and detailed. At the beginning, all they tell us about the eclipses, the first eclipse is the eclipse of February the 6th, 747 BCE, zero. They tell us the watch of the night that it occurred in. So they're dividing the night into 3 watches and they're saying, well, it occurred in the first. They tell us the side of the lunar disk that was eclipsed. So there's your partial. But 200 years later, for the eclipse of October 6th, 554, you get the position of the moon relative to the fixed stars at the time of the eclipse. You get the positions of the visible planets. You get the approximate angles of entrance and exit, the magnitude and the duration of the eclipse, time intervals of the onsets, of totality, and of clearing. And all of that is to a precision of about 4 minutes. So they're clearly trying to get more data at some point because they know something here is working. There is patterns here that if we collect enough, we are going to find stuff out. But at that point, it's not clear that this is just restricted to celestial phenomena. They are also increasing their detailed observation of things like market fluctuations and weather and all these other spheres where maybe if you get enough patterned data, you're going to see that in fact this stuff is predictable as well. Maybe, history is working in these cycles that are just as predictable as the cycles of the heavens. So it's an astronomy that develops not because people are looking at the stars and are interested in them specifically, but because the stars are the only thing that respond to this method of data collection in the way that the data collectors are hoping they'll be able to. This is just the thing that happens to be actually predictable in all of the different stuff that they're observing. Okay. So that was what I was telling you about. That's where we get the Saros cycle from. But I wanted to just focus as well on this requires like an institutional organization which is founded on expertise, which requires a really lengthy education and credentialing. You have to be apprenticed to one of the people who can already do this in order to get this job. You have to work under them in the colleges. Maybe then you get to be chief scribe. So there is a career track for the people involved in it. And that's what Ashurbanipal is talking about when he is talking about deliberating in the assembly of scholars. He can go to one of these colleges and he can say, hey, I've seen that this, phenomenon is happening. What do you think this implies is going to happen later? And then he can debate the interpretation of the texts. This boast here, I am able to discuss the series If the Liver is a Mirror Image of the Sky with learned experts. This is quite revealing because this is one of the very final tablets of the training sequence of the Baru. So it comes from the Omen series Barutum, and it is basically an explanation of how celestial and terrestrial omens line up with one another and how you can reconcile the 2 professional knowledge spheres of the Baru and the Tutshar Enuma Anu Enlil and understand, like, if the liver is a mirror image of the sky, what does this omen in the entrails, how does it match omens in the sky? So he's really saying not only have I mastered both of these professions, I've mastered them in a way that allows me to reconcile them. I know the most complicated texts in this tradition. A lot of the omens in here are purely theoretical. They involve astronomical events that could never happen in the real world, like planets or like stars, constellations moving, things like that. Um, so
still no, mechanism of why the liver is in the room. This guy's just
nothing, just the details of how they match up. Yeah. So
Could I
yeah.
just ask one briefly related question, going back to the earlier question? You mentioned that Paul was unusual as a king in being there, but was it this you introduced him that is because he was the second or third person? Was it common for the royal families to see that one of their members gets into this group of scribes, or was this
Certainly, yeah. If you've got multiple sons, not all of them can be king. You want to put them in these positions of power in the court. And to be an administrator, you really need to train in one or more of these professions.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, this is something that fluctuates. Like Seneca doesn't like scholarship and anyway. So okay, what did I want to say?
Sorry.
No, I'm glad people are interrupting because I'm going to run out of stuff in a minute. So if you've got questions or if what I'm saying is not making sense, especially, or there are like things that aren't clear, jump in. I'm barreling ahead, but I want to hear what other people have to say. But this is what I wanted to really get to is that in the Mesopotamian case, knowing about the sky is a profession. And it works like professions do today in law or medicine or indeed academia. And one thing that I found very helpful in thinking about this is the sociology of professions in the modern period, and particularly this book by Andrew Abbott, written in 1988, where he makes the case that this is how you get a group like accredited doctor or accredited social worker or accredited hairdresser, professions that you need a particular credential to practice in a legal regime or in a society. He says that these are basically attempts by groups to monopolize a labor market, to say that only people like us are qualified to do this work. And the strategy is always to claim jurisdiction over an area of theoretical knowledge. You can see how this works in the case of medicine, where like doctors claim jurisdiction over very broad theoretical fields, which is sort of deviance from the norms of health. And that's a thing with fuzzy borders. You could include mental health under that aegis, for instance, or you could think that you actually need psychiatrists or something to handle that. And this is the jurisdiction of another profession. There are, for instance, special areas of medicine, like podiatry, medicine of the foot, which are, again, only claimed by a particular specialization. You need special training to be a doctor who deals with this part of the human body. These divisions are very, very flexible and shifting over history. It's why we have also credentialed bodies of people like chiropractors who are accredited to perform certain medical procedures, even though the founder of chiropractic or whatever it is claims that he was taught the method by a ghost, but yet you can still become, yeah. So, so the professions that you have in a given society are not stable. They are the result of jurisdictional disputes among people who are trying to protect their own professional interests and say, you can't comment on this because you don't have the right skills. But the skills are nearly always not conceived of stuff that you can do, but as a particular theoretical body of knowledge that you have imbibed in the course of your education. So think of how you divide labor in a hospital. Doctor comes in and sees you for 5 minutes and diagnoses and decides on a course of treatment. Most of this is completely like regular work. A nurse could come in and through his or her experience working with doctors could also perform that procedure. And in fact, it will be the nurse and the lab techs and stuff like that who do the actual hands-on work of carrying out the procedures that the doctor says are going to treat you. The backing for this situation, which is inscribed in law, right? Only doctors can legally do this, is not that the nurse does the procedure worse than the doctor, because the nurse is allowed to do the procedure. It's that the doctor, at some point in their education, did some undergraduate level courses in biochemistry and physics and calculus and stuff. And it's that possession of a special knowledge which equips them to be the expert who does this. And that's why when they make exactly the same decision as an experienced nurse, their decision is the valuable one, and the nurse's is not based on this background knowledge. Of course, it doesn't, doctors aren't remembering the stuff that they studied in, 20 years ago or 15 years ago. That's not actually contributing to how they treat a disease in the great majority of situations. But this is like a fiction that the medical profession buys and the public broadly buys, and which is inscribed into law, that in fact it's going to school and getting the right degree that is the thing that makes the difference between competence and incompetence in this case.
Just in my experience, because that's very specific. My mom studied both medicine and nursing. The nursing degree took 2 years, the medicine one took 6 years.
Yeah.
She says all of her nursing degree was just learning how to actually interact with patients. Like they do kind of learn very different things because what they need to do is very different.
Certainly. But then what they actually do in the hospital, much of what you pick up as a nurse is seeing the doctor respond to diseases that you see every day or situations that you see every day. So the practical skills, like what you just said is,
Seems so much of medicine anyway.
maybe so, but think about what you just said. Like it's the education in the background of the decision making that makes the difference, and that means that we are not locating the qualification in the procedures performed or the skills necessary to perform them, but in knowledge that the doctor has and the nurse doesn't. So this, I think, is really, really useful for understanding what's going on.
I mean, one
Yeah,
aspect that
Mesopotamia.
I would maybe because I'm rather thinking about medieval craft skills in this way, but that as important as what you're allowed to do is also what you're not allowed to do as part of the profession.
Yes, true.
So, which is not always just to do with other professions, but this is something that you don't do, which brings me back to the kind of maybe these scribes were not allowed to do any kind of causal speculation or causal mechanism because this is just not what you're allowed to do.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what actually was the case in China with the astronomers there, that they were not allowed to interpret the observations they made.
Interesting. Okay.
That was the task of the king. Or the emperor. And then so
the emperor did all of the actual interpretive speculative work on. Oh man, I didn't know.
Even though all those scribes, astronomers were trained in Confucian philosophy, where all the interpretations were based on. But no, you are not doing this. in that way, yes, as a doctor, no, I'm not allowed to transgress the boundaries of my profession.
Yes, yeah, precisely. So there's like a sphere in which you're allowed to act and a sphere in which you're not allowed to, a much broader sphere in which you're not allowed to act. But you're also part of a guild. I mean, I think the guild is really the primary model here to be thinking with.
There's a big part of history where astronomers were meant to measure what's happening in the sky, but the philosophers were the ones that interpret it.
Yeah.
So nowadays astrophysics wouldn't be considered, so they interpret what it means, but for a very long time it was, a lot across the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, well, do you find that your colleagues in physics are ever skeptical about cultural astronomy being part of the physics program? Is there jurisdictional dispute?
No, because, I mean, look, not necessarily because there is an understanding, I would hope. I don't have many of these conversations. That we're looking at two different things.
Yeah.
That one of them is about observing and interpreting the motions and physical properties and nature of the stars themselves. And what I'm very clear about the starting is we're looking at how we understand and connect, which means astrophysics would be part of that.
Yeah.
But so would astrology, so would mathematical, divinational astronomy, so would indigenous, any of those would all be part of that. Astrophysics would be one aspect of that.
Right. Yeah.
So how much the rest of the school really understands that, I don't know. I suspect in physics, they know I'm there, they have some general idea that I'm doing something, and that's probably the extent of where it goes. And they just trust that I'm not going to have students dividing across campus and prognosing astrological interpretations of it. At least they would hope so.
Physics, I think, is a good case because its jurisdictional boundaries are quite clear. What you say is interesting, but it's clear in that like lay people don't often jump into the world of physics and start putting out their own. Oh, yeah. Interesting. Okay. And they do.
Totally, and
Uh-huh.
there's no professional astronomers in there. Oh, there might be, that's not their role.
Mm.
And they have a astronomy, astrophysics and cosmology section that is this week discussing new models of gravitational theory that some guys come up with, which I'm just going, I'm starting to understand.
Okay, that's interesting.
I'll get angry.
I guess I'm thinking that there's like especially in like health, or if you take, so you can do a degree in like business administration, for instance, but the jurisdictional boundaries of that are quite porous in that you don't need the degree to be recognized as having useful things to say about how to run a business by people who do that. Whereas with physics, perhaps many people intrude into it, but I suspect that they're not taken particularly seriously without.
No, it's not broad within the professional
Yeah.
realm. I mean, there are certainly people who want to interpret it, but they don't understand the language, the mathematics behind it. And
Yeah.
conversely, you'll get the physicists who want to go outside of their profession and assume the way we approximate and model things in physics can apply to any other discipline. And they'll come
Yes.
into your turf and you're going, what the hell are you doing? And you're not even close.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. But my turf, like,
Yeah.
why? Sorry.
I think you're right there again. Professors monopolize the labor market. Oh, with this kind of amateur quantum mechanics, you don't make any money from this.
Yes.
Unless-
You are never going to hire someone without a PhD in physics
Yeah.
to teach physics at a
Yeah.
university. Yeah.
correct, except these guys, because they got me with a PhD in diesel. But the idea is, if you're going to be a professional astronomer, there's a membership to the Astronomical Society or the International Astronomical Union, for example. And
Exactly. Yeah.
those are the kinds of things where even if you don't have to have this part of the licensing, it's an expectation, and you would meet these requirements to be able to have that to display your professional status.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, hang on, something to check. So the profession has to do a couple of things. First, you have to convince everyone that you've got this theoretical knowledge that's really important, that makes you qualified to predict the future. I mean, modern medicine, there is like an actual proof case, right? You can cure just some diseases some of the time. But these guys, what they are saying they can do, they cannot do. They can predict eclipses, sure, but like they cannot predict the fortunes of a particular king. They have to. They don't have a legal structure which really enforces their ability to make claims about divination. They have to convince people that going through this incredibly difficult training is necessary and equips them to perform their tasks in a way that other people are not equipped to do. So a lot of what they are using astronomy for is as the first proof case that actually we do know what we're doing. Look, we'll predict you an eclipse. We'll tell you exactly how long this phase of totality will last. The whole monopoly over the labor market is going to rest on a public faith that only those in possession of the theoretical body of knowledge can act effectively in the domain in question. And that's really not true. So how do you do this? The texts that we have and the skills that we have preserved on these texts, these are deliberately difficult, deliberately extensive and lengthy. In fact, we know that they weren't relied on very often. Most of the omens that our chief scribes report to the king are drawn from a very select set of about 150, whereas there are thousands and thousands available to them in the full series of tablets. So although they are reading and memorizing and copying these tablets, that's not the basis of their day-to-day reality. They are working with a set of skills that you could teach in 2 months to someone who was illiterate. But they don't do that, of course. And I wanted to look at a couple of letters.
Quickly.
Yeah.
This actual training that they went under, was it structured as an apprenticeship kind of thing where they were apprenticed under someone who was already well established, or was there an actual like educational system that they went through?
You're always apprenticed. You learn to write in the family home when you're 10 to 12. It takes a while for you to get just the scribal practice down. Then you go on to specialize in the curriculum of one of these particular professions, and you memorize and learn to copy from memory the Barutum or the Enuma Anu Enlil, and it's preparing these tablets that is your induction into the profession proper.
So that
So
was done under a specific, like one person, it wasn't like an educated system, that was like systematic, it was done under one specific, like you were repressing under one person.
yeah, in this period, yes. Yeah. So I wanted to take a quick look at just some of the actual letters I was telling you about before, from chief scribes to the king. All of the letters we'll look at were written under Esarhaddon or Ashurbanipal, both of whom took an interest in these affairs. And this is an interesting problem for these scribes, because usually the king doesn't know anything about this. And now they're dealing with a king who wants to be able to debate and interpret with them. So you have to show the king that there is this knowledge there, praise him for his attainments in this knowledge, but also get across that, in fact, you know a lot more about it than he ever could, and he still needs you around to help. So here's Balasi, who was working under Ashurbanipal, talking to Ashurbanipal. Concerning the tablet of Shruma Isbu, this is an omen series, about which the king my lord wrote to me, look at it. Who would write, and then something's dropped out or been damaged, in Shruma Isbu. So that's the king's words. Look at this. Who would write this in Shruma Isbu? He says, there's a particular tablet in which this thing is written, and I'm now sending it to the king. King should have a look. Maybe the scribe who reads to the king did not understand. I suspect what's happened here is that Ashurbanipal has misinterpreted something in Shruma Isbu and has asked Balasi, what's going on here? This sounds crazy. And he's politely saying, maybe the person who was reading this to you got this wrong. Shruma Isbu is difficult to interpret. The first time that I come before the king, my lord, I shall personally show, with this tablet that I'm sending to the king, how the omen is written. Really, one who has not had the meaning pointed out to him cannot possibly understand it. But this is the claim, right? Like, unless you've gone through this college system, you're not going to get the details of this. You really need the background, the theoretical thing, before you can start working with these texts professionally. It's all well and good to be interested. Good on you, Ashurbanipal. But you still need my help.
That's just the text and the learning. You need there's something else on top of it in order to get anywhere.
Exactly. And that's something else is the 10 years that you spent apprentice to somebody who knows how to do this, who taught you all this stuff. Interesting problem. What happens when you are in a professional dispute with one of your colleagues from another college? How do you convince the king that it's your interpretive skills? You've both gone through the same training. How do you tell the king that you've done this? Here's how Balasi does it. Concerning the planet Venus, about which the king my lord wrote to me, I'm told that it has become visible. The man who wrote thus to the king my lord is in complete ignorance. He does not know something, the cycle of something, or the synodic revolutions of Venus. Venus is not yet visible. Who is the man that writes so to the king my lord? I repeat, he does not understand the difference between Mercury and Venus.
Having very marginal astronomical training, that doesn't require at least a month astronomical training.
Yes. Yeah.
So
I mean, it's again like an appeal. I've got this training, so does the other person, but look at this ridiculous mistake that he's made. He's confused Mercury and Venus. How embarrassing. Like, maybe he did do this. Wouldn't be surprising, because these people are spending most of their time, reading and copying tablets. But again, the dispute is couched in these terms of my knowledge has equipped me to avoid this sort of mistake, and that's why I should be the reliable source of information here. There's another one like this, which the persuasive strategy is even less sophisticated. He doesn't explain what the mistake is. He just says this person who said that the planet Venus is visible is a vile man, an ignoramus, a cheat. Venus is not yet visible. These seem like questions that should be easily answered.
Talking outside, actually.
Exactly. So Why does someone tell lies and boast about it? If he does not know, he should keep his mouth shut. Again, this is just like a don't trust this guy. He's an idiot. He's a liar. Uh, an alternative approach was from a junior scribe. Well, he's not junior. He's less senior than the people we've been looking at. And I think it's interesting how he tries to convince the scribe that the king that he's right. He says, Jupiter stood behind the moon. Here's the relevant interpretation. If Jupiter stands behind the moon, there will be hostility in the land. Oh, king, my lord, this is a matter concerning us. This sign pertains to the king, my lord. You should care about this. Something bad is going to happen. And then he says, perhaps the king, my lord, does not believe me. Maybe he is in one of these disputes with another astronomer who's made the opposite claim. This idiot thinks Jupiter is behind the moon. No, it's not. The back of the moon should be shown to a eunuch who has a sharp eye. There is less than a span left to close. He should stand in shadow to observe. The king, my lord, will soon believe me. So here's the strategy of someone who's lower on the professional ladder. It's not, don't trust that idiot. It's get a eunuch, go outside, check it for yourself.
Yeah.
See if I'm right or not.
Incidentally, it's one of the few examples that I've really seen of the application of moon over a planet described in historical tradition.
Really?
Just out of curiosity, this is where it's fairly tangential. Were they aware of precession?
Yes. Well, I couldn't tell you the
At
details.
what point in Mesopotamia on that timeline that became known?
That sounds like a last 300 years of the Common Era kind of thing. But yeah, I wouldn't know off the top of my head when precisely.
Because there's basically all the earlier records of the Sumerians and Akkadians and Babylonians that they realized things were shifted by.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me. So remember that guy Ishar-Shumu Eresh? He was like the very successful chief scribe who worked in Nineveh for Ashurbanipal, son of a previous chief scribe. He's got a very interesting relationship with the king. And I just wanted to look at two letters of his, which are revealing in this way. All right, here's one. Concerning what the king, my lord, wrote to me, why have you never told me the truth? When will you actually tell me all that there is to it? That's interesting. This is Ashurbanipal, and he is clearly trying to extract the knowledge that he values so much and that he wants to be master of from his chief diviner, his chief scribe. And he feels that Ishar-Shumu Eresh is holding stuff back from him, that there is sort of a secret thing there that he could win to himself. Obviously, Ishar-Shumu Eresh has to deny that he holds anything back, and he says, all of these gods be my witnesses that I've never untruly something, the word, something to the king, my lord. And now look what he does. When the planet Mars comes out from the constellation Scorpius, turns and re-enters Scorpius, its interpretation is this. If Mars retrograding enters Scorpius, do not neglect your guard. The king should not go outdoors on an evil day. This omen is not from the series. It is from the oral tradition of the masters. This is secret knowledge that you learn in the college that I'm giving to you. This is stuff that you can't find in those tablets. And there's a real, I don't know, like a transaction happening here where maybe he's making it up, maybe it's true, but Ishar-Shumu Eresh is posing as letting the king into the secret world of the trained scribes. And let me do one more, and then I'll kind of close up. This is another debate between, this is what Ashurbanipal is talking about when he says, I can debate these things. This is the response to one of his debates. As to what the king, my lord, wrote to me, does the omen, this is Ashurbanipal speaking, does the omen, if something passes between the legs of a man, apply to something that came out from underneath a chariot? So he's asking, there's an omen about something going through my legs. If I'm in a chariot and it goes underneath the chariot, does that count? It does apply, says Ishar-Shumu Eresh. The king, my lord, says the legs of a man means legs only when something literally emerges between a man's legs. That mongoose passed between the wheels of the chariot or something. So the king's interpretation, his guess is, no, it doesn't apply. But Ishar-Shumu Eresh says, you're wrong. We still take it as important. The mongoose passed from the left to the right and emerged from underneath the chariot. As for the legs of the man about which the king my lord spoke, this is the relevant interpretation. If a mongoose passes between the legs of a man, the hand of the god or the hand of the king will seize him. So let us say mercy for the Nabateans. This is what he's supposed to do in response to the omen. Why? Well, are they not hostile kings? They will not submit beneath the chariot of the king, my lord. So the mongoose is an omen. It's passed between your legs. The hand of the king is going to seize you. The Nabateans are the best candidate for the hostile kings. Let's not try to stir up any tensions with them any further than we are, because then something bad will happen. So this is again like King tries to play the game of interpreting the omen. It's poker without any cards. Nothing happens if a mongoose passes between the legs of a man, right? But the position of the issue, well, maybe.
No experiment on their
Yeah, exactly. And some immediate consequence might occur. But he has to say, not only do I know how to interpret this better than you, I can use it to sort of guide the policy of the state in a way that affirms my value. And note again, this is a guy who we are taking first as an astronomer, but he is equally interested in mongooses passing under the chariot. So,
What's this number?
oh yeah, sorry. Just shut up.
Yes, so, I really so. I also like the local jockeys and like all of these people came and talked to them about giving advice. It's like, hey, this is a problem that my city state is having fixes, and someone else would come up from like the city state they were having a problem with. It's like we're having this problem with them. Have you tried talking it out? Like how much of it is actually like grift and how much of it is like these scribes actually having contact with the outside world and knowing a bit more than the king would advise.
The king's going to know a lot more about foreign affairs than these guys. These guys sit in their college and they look at the stars. They know nothing about anything except the texts that they're reading. I mean, they must be convinced that the knowledge is real on some level. But the dynamic here, I think, is worth looking at with real sort of outsider skepticism about the claims of this tradition to be what it is. This looks to me much better explicable in terms of Ish-Ashur-Maherish protecting his income. Yeah.
I think we have to be careful about saying that, you know, the ancients were grifting or whatever, because if you were to ask a pharaoh, did he believe he was God, he probably would have said yes. So it's kind of that, you know, they are in the religion and this environment that they're in, and they're being raised in that environment, and it's kind of Marxist for us to come in and go, well, they knew and were taking advantage of the situation. So it's kind of, they are subjects of their system just as much as they're trying to benefit from their system. So
Is it a grift if you're grifting yourself too?
Their scripts work that way, right? So, bringing all this back to a point where we can sort of profitably discuss it as cultural astronomers. It would be really interesting to know how these differences of interpretation functioned in the college itself between the experts. Our records are all from people who are trying to adjudicate these disputes by winning the favor of the king. And that's a bad situation to be in, because the king is at best, like an amateur in these affairs, and at worst, someone who's barely interested. And we just have letters to him. So the scholars are very limited in the technical expertise they can bring to bear, and they are also responding to professional pressures that I think impact what they are doing. But on the other hand, it was this professional incentive to invest very heavily in the prediction of syzygies that gave Mesopotamian divination its sole achievement that was actually effective, which was the prediction of celestial phenomena, which they learned how to do, and which then filtered into the Greek tradition, and through Ptolemy became the basis of mathematical astronomy across the Eurasian world. So the professional incentives do some interesting things. They channel all intellectual ambition into a single research program. If you're a clever son of the right family, then if you want to use your brain for a living, this is what you're going to end up doing, training in these things. But But the restrictive structure of the profession also enabled research, which couldn't have been conducted in other circumstances, and which required that massive state oversight and investment in lots of different colleges in order to achieve the results that it achieved. The Greeks could never have done this because they did not have the administrative capacity or the centralized structure to set up this kind of record-keeping system. So this just, they needed the Babylonian information in order to use this stuff.
Tom,
Yeah.
we got a couple of questions online.
Oh, sorry. Right. Ash is asking who could become a scribe? What was the process of being accepted? Got to be son of an ordained priest who's already working at the temple. You've got to be physically perfect, so you can't have lost any fingers or have bad eyesight, or you've got to have most of your teeth and can't have any big scars. You've got to go through an initiation to be able to enter the temple, which involves you being washed and then shaved 7 times from head to toe, and then checked all over. Sorry? Males only, yeah. But that probably means that many people got some way of the way down the training for this profession, and then when it came to the induction, was discovered that they had a big scar on their, buttock or something that prevented them from becoming a professional. And they've still got this knowledge; they've got to find something else to do. So, yeah. So it's a very restricted profession. So now I really am concluding. I think this is useful for us, and some of you will have seen this slide in different contexts before. When we think about the history of philosophy or the history of science or the history of astronomy, we can kind of come from the perspective that an Aristotelian perspective where trying to figure out how the world works is a natural impulse of all human beings and all human societies. And I think there is an extent to which that is true, that human beings by nature yearn for knowledge and like to figure out true things about the world or things that appear to them to be true. But it's useful also to remind ourselves that while all human beings are, in this sense, intellectuals, not all human beings occupy the role of intellectual in their own society. Not all have the professional function that allows them to speak authoritatively about the world. That's a role that is shaped by institutions, and it's a role that is shaped by the processes of education, which are considered to be knowledge providing, the system of credentialing, which annexes that knowledge to guilds or experts, the forms and the genres in which knowledge can find expression, and the audience that the knowledge is received by or directed to. And in all of these cases, the Mesopotamian tradition is really sort of a fantastic case study of how these factors shape what astronomy is in that world. The life of the mind bears various relations to the life of the body. So the history of human thought is not just the history of what people think, but also the conditions under which they get to think for a living. That's the main thing I wanted to get across there. So I'll close it off with coming back to this sort of slide, which is why I thought this would be worth going into. I've gone on quite a long time. I'll hand over and we can kind of talk or reflect for the last, half hour.
Well, thanks, Tom. That was awesome.
Thank you guys for sitting through the long thing.
I would argue this is absolutely an area of sharp books, without question. This is awesome. I love this. And this ties in. It's kind of interesting as we talk about a lot of themes that come through in this, the reflection of land on sky or river on sky. The importance of how people would want to use the stars, maybe talk about marking time, not understanding space, being able to predict, and that's probably one of the most useful things about it is to have a predictive purpose. And of course, the motivation behind why we even care about this whole idea of science in the first place, which in the Aboriginal context is very political.
Right.
It's very activist.
Yeah.
But frankly, it's why I focused on that aspect of the first place. It certainly is not the whole or even the major part of the cultural astronomy itself is about. Question?
I don't have a question, I do have one, I think like how you talked about this almost as like treating, Mesopotamian, Babylonian, astronomy is almost like a case study, because it is that, there's no, like, it's an example of cultural astronomy that is a solid endpoint, a solid start point. And so we can almost treat it like a case study in comparison with other stuff. But then as you've discussed there, it's almost a great example of why you can't have a case study of cultural astronomy, because everything has these nuances and these niches that make it very, very specific, like with this example of how it was all about trying to ensure positions within the system and using it purely for divination, and it is it's a very unique example of how cultural astronomy was used. And so I don't know really where I'm getting with this, but I think it's both a great case study and a great example of why case studies don't work in this kind of field in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So of course there can be lots of variation in the way traditions go about this. I do think it can function as a case study in the following way. Imagine if all we had from this tradition is like a couple of tablets that lay out the Saros cycle, or an archaeological record of an observatory, or something like that. If you were coming to that and you knew nothing about all this social context that we happen to have, how would you interpret this material? You would interpret it according to the data it records, and there is a danger of interpreting it as thinking like the fact that the eclipses were recorded means that there was an orientation in the culture towards knowledge of the heavens that was valued for its own sake, that was valued for precision and accuracy, that was achieved by empirical observation, and that was quantified in this way. All of those would be to some extent true. But the entire social structure in which these aspects of the culture came into being would be invisible to you. And I think it's worth considering whether in cases where we don't have this kind of record, whether not exactly the same social structure is underlying it, but that there could be this massive complexity underneath, which is very, very orthogonal to the motives that we attribute to cultures that appear to be paying attention to the sky.
I think with the Mesopotamian example as well, it did proliferate across the Near East. And so there's examples for Ugarit, where another, I think, Mari and Ima, where the Anu and Lil is found in parts in those areas. And then people have just gone, oh, well, they're completely useless because, like modern scholars, like they're completely useless because eclipses aren't very common. So why would you need them? Because they're dismissing the divinatory nature of it, and that its significance wasn't about recording the eclipses for the purposes, as you say, like it's not for monitoring the heavens, it's for another purpose. And so modern scholars like Neugebauer and stuff, they kind of dismiss the divination element of it and the astrological element of it for Mesopotamia and the associated cultures, because it wasn't in the pursuit of knowledge, of scientific knowledge, I guess. Whereas the idea for it was that it was part of a way to try and interpret and predict an unpredictable world and environment, and bring a bit of certainty potentially to their, like, especially for a king in a tumultuous era, about his reign. So you may disagree completely, but yeah.
No, not at all. That's just
I think that highlights that's part of the contemporary issue with cultural astronomy. This is why I talk about reflexivity and positionality within research. I had students in archaeological astronomy doing this, right? You guys do this week, right? It's due time. So a lot of people who have a background in astronomy are going to refuse to engage in anything that might be considered astrological. But when you're looking at the context, social context, it was very much based in astrology. So the astronomer who doesn't want to have their name associated with the ology, part of it, is going to ignore that, reject it, refute it, whatever. Their position on it in the research is going to be one that dismisses it. And they're not going to get the cultural context of why this has to be the case. And they're also going to bring their own push and to want to focus on the quantitative aspects of the predictive nature, because they're comfortable with number crunching and equations and doing that stuff. So they're going to focus on the emphasis in that, as opposed to everything else. So with the class, I'm having them do this positional and reflexivity statement about what they bring and how their work ties into it, and give them some examples of extremes of like ancient aliens. It's being a really bad example of how that can be applied. But I think in a broader context, it ties into why after 50 odd years of working cultural astronomy, we still don't have any kind of comprehensive disciplinary theoretical framework.
Yeah.
It's just, I mean, there's in that sciencey sort of aspect of a theoretical framework, you need to be able to put a model together that's going to explain why people do this, that's going to apply everything. You know, and if they do this, then that's going to happen. Where you see things that tie into that, but they're so interchangeable, the interpretations are so wide, you can't get much more than a very general look at it. Because I know a lot of people try over the years to do that, you know, bring in a theoretical framework looking at specific communities or in a specific narrow area of cultural astronomy, but not as a wider one, which is why I'm excited about this and you giving this talk here, because this introduces people to a whole different area, just like we've been doing before. We're not looking at bloody alignments and trying to figure out what we can glean just from an archaeological record, but it's not purely a living, it's not a living entity at all. So I love this lecture.
Thanks. I always come back to that thing, the story you've told a couple of times about the glyph on rock art that has been misinterpreted as a supernova, or a record of an eclipse. The supernova.
The supernova of 1054 is how it's interpreted. It's Chaco Canyon in Arizona.
Right. But there was, maybe I'm thinking of another one in Australia where
there's most of them. There was the one that was of the eclipse.
Yeah.
The man and the woman standing like this, and they were kind of partially overlapping.
Yeah.
But the crests of the crescent were pointing downwards, because archaeologists said, well, those two were having some husband and wife time, and they needed a windbreak so it wasn't so cold. And then the astronomers were like, oh, but that's the moon, and that's the cusps of the moon, and the pointing down, but the cusp of the moon will never point down unless it's some kind of total solar eclipse in the right orientation. And this is seen as the sun woman and the moon man embracing an act of love, because there's a hermaphroditic fluid a couple meters away would show one figure with both, the sexual organs on it. There's this is a total eclipse of God.
Right.
Where does this come from?
Yeah. And then you said that the guide at the site had incorporated this interpretation into the explanation.
Well,
because knowing about an eclipse it sounds very impressive in the sort of values of the culture assessing, rather than
well, that's exactly right. That was the other example I gave the class of a personal one where this kind of interpretation's gone south. Because we're thinking, well, look, this is one of many interpretations. This is me, but if it's attractive enough, and hits those, ticks those boxes in the way that people kind of like, that's something kind of cool, then all those qualifiers get eroded away, and what comes out of that is a definitive binary. Either it is or it isn't. And then people say, oh yes, this is an eclipse, right? Here's what we're looking at. There's no could be, maybes. Two idiot astronomers decided one day they thought it might be, but this is what it is. Right. And you see the same thing with Chaco Canyon, supernova rock art, or rock art study. So Chaco Canyon is it's a rock, so it's in the put that around if you want it. So it's petroglyphs in Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest with the Chaco people who at the time were called Anasazi. That's not really kind of a term you want to use these days. It was sort of a cross-tribal racist term used to describe the others. But there's this idea that there was a crescent moon figure and a bright object figure, and there's actually another figure below that almost looks like a fireball or a comet. And the idea was what this was depicting was the supernova of 1054, because in the ancient Chinese records, they had noted it occurring around the 4th of July, 1054, which if you go back and you learn, you see that the supernova occurred very close to a waxing moon, crescent moon. And isn't that exciting? This is a supernova rock art, one of the only examples that blah, 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 and became very famous. This paper was published in an edited volume. The very next paper completely took it apart. The very next page by anthropologists who've been working with those communities and showing how this is a very common motif and it relates to Venus and the crescent moon, which is a global motif you see everywhere, right? But which one's more attractive? Terminology used back then is which one's sexy? Well, that one clearly is, and now if you go to the site, it says supernova rock art. It's actually a tag, it's pretty hot. But that became a really attractive one that everybody uses. And the idea of even implying it was just Venus and a crescent moon is now perceived by some as trying to discredit their capacity to have observed something. It's like, no, we're not discrediting it. It was visible, super bright in the sky, everybody could see.
Yeah.
It was probably incorporated into oral tradition, almost certainly, and maybe there is rock art. But if you don't have somebody who made the rock art telling you this is what it means, then it's open to interpretation. So it becomes very politicized.
I've just gone onto the earthsky.org article, and they're talking about how it's a supernova. And the only reference they give to it, like there being like other ideas around it, is that although the connection remains controversial, that is the only one they have for the fact that this is probably
Because a non-controversial or a non-extractive one is not going to get readers.
No.
It's not, it's the marketing 101, right? You gotta tell the story that's gonna get people interested, which is why everybody, I ain't really rambling on that.
Yeah.
So I give us a point of conspiracy theory.
Yeah, but just, somebody else was, wanted to go back to, the question of positionality, because I definitely enjoyed reading the Neugebauer versus Peterson Spiel, because it brought me back to my own upbringing as a historian of science, given that I didn't know Neugebauer personally, but certainly some people from his generation and how they were thinking. One of the things that's quite interesting about them, this kind of very Central European, early 20th century born historians of mathematical science, is that quite often they would say, yeah, actually, I'm working what's important. And they would actually have a huge cultural background, which would never go into the publication, because the publication, what matters is the history of mathematical development.
Yeah.
That matters more than culture. Culture is a living phenomenon, and what lasts is this. So one of the questions you think about, and this is a hard one, why do we think that understanding knowledge is culturally embedded is? Why do we think this? And you're not allowed to say because it's a better view of mathematics or astronomy. Why do we think this way, that treating this as an entirely thing about an abstract knowledge is not the way to go?
Why not just treat
all of this? You can clearly see where Neugebauer was coming from, lots of cultural pessimism that was getting in the US in the post-World War II thing, to have an understanding of mathematics, of science as something entirely abstract and not something that builds bombs and all those kind of things. But why do we think about the way knowledge in culture the way we think about it?
Gerd has an excellent point here, because especially with mathematical astronomy, you can, in the way that you can't with, say, physical or chemical theories, you can tell a very continuous story about the progressive development of that knowledge from ancient Mesopotamia through to Newton. And there's no reason to dismiss that. Yes, sure.
Yeah.
And it's not clear why that should not be preferable to a socially embedded history, any more than a history that tells us about the underwear they were wearing. Or
I think the fact that they also like to divorce it from the, as you say, the cultural system. It's like it's on its own, and its knowledge is pure, versus it's actually something born out of the religious and cultural framework in which it was developed. And so if that framework wasn't there, you wouldn't have the knowledge, as you say, from the supportive, the fact that it took an entire network of organized scholars to be able to produce this kind of outcome in Mesopotamia that was then transmitted. But I think that the cultural context, whether it's when you're looking at a culture like I did with the Phoenicians, where there's not the written text, we don't have the mathematical scripts, but we have to understand the cultural context in which it was sat and how it also related to other cultures of the time, such as the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, and then see how that network could have functioned cross-culturally.
But why do we have to understand that? If we think about mathematical problems and how they were solved, we don't care whether they were working in a temple or whether they were working in tax office.
Yeah.
They just had problems to solve, and they did solve them.
But that goes into the whole hierarchy of knowledge and when we're conceptualizing valuing knowledge and where it comes from. Even like the history of maths, we see it from this very Anglo sort of, Westerny sense. Maybe not so much Anglo, but Western. It's like, omitting so much knowledge there and creating.
I basically should, I think at that point, put a little bit more explanation to what I just said with the cultural pessimism. So Neugebauer, born in Austria, is one of a generation very clearly brought up with already a slightly anti-modernist stance. They were deeply shocked by World War One and realized, oh, culture's lost. It's the kind of post-colonial decline of the West thing. Basically, civilization is doomed. So our task is to preserve what's important for any future civilizations. And what's important are the mathematical problems. These are the things we have to look at. Everything else can be forgotten. This one needs to last.
It's very interesting position to take.
Yeah.
I mean, he claims that Egypt didn't have proper astronomy
Yeah.
because there was no mathematics that he could detect involved in it.
Yeah.
So even though they had very advanced calendar systems and, you know, had sky watching as a kind of career, like Mesopotamia.
Well, he praises their calendar. He says it's the only sensible calendar ever developed in human history. Yeah.
Because they had the solar and they told it to geographical locations across the EU as well. So, but yeah, it's and then other people did count Egyptian, and then but the idea as well, this is something I've come across a lot of times, is that it also lends legitimacy in some cases to some cultures because they've got their knowledge from the Greeks, which is a whole other argument about, you know, the origin of Western society, but then they got it from the Mesopotamians, and it kind of provides that legitimacy of that knowledge path as well on the way.
This is part of what was attractive for Norgeba. And so he fled the Holocaust. And I think he was viewing his history of the exact sciences as basically a history that went against the idea that the Greeks were these marvelous people who invented philosophy. Actually, what they did was delay the progress of the exact sciences by irrelevant theoretical speculation by hundreds of years. It begins in the Middle East, it carries on through Europe, and then it spreads to India and other parts of the world. So it's a version of this history that is explicitly anti-Western tradition for Norgeba. And there is something appealing in especially, I mean, like, yes, we're doomed. What should we be preserving?
And it was quite interesting because in the sense, yes, not Neugebauer, but others like Matthias Schramm went then into Latin American, some Mayan Aztec mathematics. Yeah, oh, yeah, and the Inca with the Hebrew system, that's fantastic. And let's do all this kind of work. And
Yeah.
just, yes. Because yes, then also, of course, this kind of classic view that mathematics ultimately is eternal, and so that transcends human history. And this is why we're doing this.
So much of the history of astronomy is tied in with those ancient Greek positions that got adopted into religious doctrine that prevented so much of happening. You can look at I wrote about variable star research. That was Aristotle's whole thing. The stars are invariable, static. You know, they don't change. You can see it change. No, they don't really change. There's something else wrong. And then that position, even when people could see the obvious, took a long time for it to come through.
Ptolemy never admits that he violates the basic criterion of Aristotelian celestial motion in displacing the center of the universe for. Yeah.
Is it? I'm still on this in case.
Excellent. Yeah.
That?
Oh,
yeah. Right. Well, it's 4 o'clock. I'm gonna stop the recording now.